Welcome to Bards and Barrels, the podcast for Dungeons & Dragons players new and old. We're just a few 30-something dads who play D&D on the regular. I'm Ross Struess, and I'm joined by my friends and co-hosts Brett Miller and Phil Boone. We'll be exploring the world of Dungeons & Dragons in each episode, sharing our experiences, offering tips and advice for those who play and run this classic game. Don't miss out on us discussing everything from character creation to combat mechanics and even delving into some of the lore behind the game. We'll also be sharing some of our funniest and most memorable moments from our own D&D campaigns. So whether you're a new player just starting out or a seasoned veteran looking to reminisce about your own adventures or just get a new perspective on things, Bards and Barrels has something for everyone. So sit back, grab a drink, and join us as we roll for initiative and embark on this epic adventure. Oh yeah, there it is. Yes, perfect. Good job, boys. It's time for another episode of Bards and Barrels.
We got the barrels flowing. We're good.
Yeah, we're feeling good right now. It's great. Today, we're going to talk about building your first character. As you know, in previous episodes, we've been talking about how we got into D&D, and then we've started into our class reviews. But now it's time to talk about how to build that character. So I think a good way to start off on this episode, guys, do you remember your first character?
Barely. It's kind of like a character I kind of want to forget at this point.
I definitely don't remember, like, my very first character. I remember the very first character I cared about. Does that count?
Sure. Yeah. Who was it?
Jeremiah Brewmaster.
Oh, good name.
Monk.
I like that. I feel like he might need to be the Bards and Barrels unofficial mascot. Or official mascot. Jeremiah Brewmaster.
Like Way of the Drunken Master or something like that.
Yes.
I think that's
that's
monk.
Exactly what we are.
We haven't got to that class yet, but that's what he was. It fit, right?
My first character was a wizard, and it was interesting playing. His name was Magnus. Can't remember his last name, but yeah, that was interesting. So maybe a better question is, maybe we don't remember our first characters, but do you remember creating your first couple characters, like the whole process?
Oh, God, it was kind of miserable.
And why?
Because I did it on paper.
I think one of the things to know, though, too, is so we're all 5th edition D&D players, the newest edition as of today's date. People that had to build characters before 5th edition had a totally different experience that I think was a lot more difficult from what I've read and things I've listened to. And I'm soon to create a 2nd edition character for another thing I'm doing, so I'll let you know once I find that out. But I actually think we have it even easier now than it was before.
Well, I find it hard that there'd be a harder way to create a character.
Wasn't there a lot of math and stuff that you had to calculate everything?
Yeah, and I think like live time, you had to do a lot of different calculations to figure out if you hit. And
see, we could never do that. We like to drink too much while we play, build, even podcast. So that might be, calculations are not good.
You guys drink while we do this?
What?
Well, yeah, what have you been doing?
There's just too many choices to have to make, too many things you have to reference in the books, in different books, especially if you have more than just the player's handbook. It's just a lot to have to skim through and find on the fly as you're trying to build a character for the first time.
Well, and I think especially too, you're talking multiple books. So sure, if you just want to use the basic rules, first time player, everything's kind of there for you. But if you really want to start branching out into, what are some of the, kind of more unique classes, or what are some of the races that aren't in the standard player's handbook or the basic rules, then you're talking about flipping through multiple books and reading some of this section, reading some of that section. Oh, I want a custom background. I mean, that gets tough to stay on top of.
So I think just for clarification for everybody, we are going to stick to the core rule book, player's handbook style of building a character. We're not going to talk about things out in supplemental books. We'll get into that later, but for the sake, we're doing this from the perspective of somebody jumping in for the very first time.
And I will say there are some easier ways than how we did it. You don't necessarily have to do it on paper. We'll touch on that here in a little bit. But let's run through first. In the player's handbook and the basic rules, they have the same set of information on building your first character. And they walk you through that process. And first up is the kind of oddly, the first two up there are picking your race first and then your class. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think it's for us. It's weird that race is there first because we were kind of talking before this episode that we all know what class we want to do going into a build. So I think just that order is a little weird right off the bat. And Phil, what thoughts do you have?
I agree with you. So when I go into building a character, I already know what class I want to play. I don't always know the race I want to play. And usually what I end up doing is saying, hey, I'm going to play this class. And then I go look up the races and figure out which one's best at playing that class. Where do I get the most bonuses? Now, that's a min-max type character, and not everyone likes to play that style. So the other way that I approach it occasionally is, you know what, hey, I've never played this race. I want to try that one this time.
But if you haven't looked up in the player's handbook yet, the race is your type of person, your race. So are you going to be a human? Are you going to be an elf, a mountain dwarf, a dragonborn, a half-orc, those type of features? The class is getting into some of those class features that we've had different episodes about. So like the barbarian, the cleric, the warlock, druid, sorcerer, those are your classes that you had to pick from. So you pick a race and a class as your kind of core to your character.
And I will say that I do think that the race plays less of an important role. So you want to make sure that you're picking the class you want to play because that's going to be your style of play. The race truly is just a complement to your class.
And I think it's important to note that while it is secondary to a lot of things, if you're rolling with a player's handbook on page 12, there's an ability score summary. There are benefits to choosing a race, and it kind of lists those out based on ability scores, like where certain races would give you a +2 or a +1 or something like that. So there is some mild benefits, but basically, at least from our perspective, we like to go into it knowing what class, which has a greater impact on your character versus the race.
So if you're trying to pick your first class, then you have a few decisions to make. Are you going to be a magic wielder? Are you going to be a fighter or some sort of like melee combatant? Or are you going to be more of like a utility character? And there's a lot of different flexibility in and amongst all the different classes to be able to pick which style of play you're feeling like going after.
Well, I think one of the things that we've hit on even in our class builds, right, are we've looked at the cleric, we've looked at a barbarian. Some of those are on your easier side to play too. So we're trying to find things that maybe aren't too difficult for a first-time player to look at. But a lot of that comes down to, as Brett said, do you want to play magic? That's a big one, right? Because some of your classes have no magic. So that's an important question to take into consideration at the top.
I think another thing is you're not ever really going to be building a character in a vacuum. It's very rare that you're going to be out there and just build a character that you're going to build a table. You're probably going to have a group and you're going to be talking about party build too. So you're going to have an idea of what class you need to go with based on what other people in your party are doing. So, if you need a healer, you're going to go cleric, like we've talked about before, things like that.
If that discussion's not happening already in your party, make it happen because it's important. You don't always want to have an entire party playing the same class unless it's intentional. If you're all trying to be bards just to F around, fine. Like, I get it. But make sure that you're intentional about that. If not, talk about it because you want a balanced party.
The weird thing is, in the player's handbook, that's step 6 is getting together with your party and discussing who you want to play. I would say that needs to come a lot earlier. Even just some very rough, like, I'm thinking about doing like a barbarian or a warlock. What are you guys thinking? That's all you have to say.
Okay, but before we move on, ability scores are next, and before we move on to that, you made me think of like it would be hilarious to play like a troop of 4 bards who are like touring.
Halfling bards.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Oh, we just found an idea for a one shot in the future.
Subscribe for that one. Coming soon.
Oh my god, that would be hilarious. Okay, so moving on to ability scores. So once you've chosen your race and your class, the next thing is to find out your points that you're going to play with. And these affect like roll bonuses and things that you're going to get throughout the game. And there are things that will increase these, so on and so forth, but there's 3 specific ways you can come up with your ability score numbers. One is the standard array, which we'll talk about in a second. The second is YOLO. You're just going to roll numbers and see how it comes out. And then third is the point buy. So thoughts on that before we get into each of those guys?
you're playing a dice-based game that has some ups and downs. You're going to need to accept it. I would heavily suggest rolling for your ability scores.
I like to roll for my scores, and typically if I'm DMing, I'll give my players the option to roll, and if they really roll like crap, then I'll let them take the standard array.
I was actually going to mention exactly what you said, because I that's how I've done it in the past too, is like roll it. If it's great, sure. If not, there's a fallback. So
Right.
it's always worth it to YOLO first, and then we'll figure out things from there.
I would say though, if you have some really crappy rolls and you only have maybe one decent number, that can also make for a really interesting character.
I would agree, and I've never forced anyone into that, but if they want to keep it, that's fine, because I do think it can present some really fun, playable moments as a character, having some terrible scores. And, every class has the ability to increase some ability scores.
Yep.
So you always can recover a little bit, right? I think that's important to notate as well.
And I think that boils down to theory on the individual player, right? So it's like you're either the type of player that's going to min max and set up so you have a fairly even point based character, or you roll and you take what you get and you end up with a character that's probably going to be more fun to role play than actually mechanically play with.
Yeah.
So if you haven't looked at what your ability scores actually go into, there are 6 main ability scores that a lot of your character sheet is going to be based off of these 6 main scores. As you level up, they'll increase, and they kind of cascade throughout your character sheet. But you have strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. And those are really what helps shape your character.
And then it's once you have your class, when you're looking at your individual classes, either in the core rule book or in the player's handbook, the quick build is going to help you allocate those numbers. And so it's not like you're just doing this and guessing where you need to keep these numbers. Like, it will tell you, or at least give you a general idea of how you should build a character that's specifically what you want.
Yeah, and so I think jumping back over to the 3 types, right? So the standard array, if we take a look at that, what that does is it will allow you to take 6 scores, 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8. And then you have to pick which one of those categories, which one of the 6 scores we just talked about, you're going to place those in. So what is the difference between a 15 and an 8? What does that mean?
It really depends on your character. If you're taking if we just talked about barbarian a few weeks ago, if you take strength as an 8, you're going to be a really weak barbarian. Versus if you take a 15 in strength, you really want your highest number to fit your class.
Also, the difference between those two numbers is the modifier that it gives you, and that's what it boils down to. And there is a chart in both the core rulebook and the player's handbook that tells you. So the actual physical number difference between a 15 and an 8 is that 15 gives you a +2 and an 8 gives you a -1 on a roll. So if you're rolling with an ability with an 8, you roll that, and whatever number it comes out to be, you're going to take away 1, whereas with the 15, you're going to add 2 to it. And that's a big difference.
And going back to Brett's point about, as a barbarian, your strength roll. If your strength's a 15, you're adding +2 to whatever you rolled on your d20. If your strength's an 8, you have to subtract 1 off of your roll. Huge difference.
And all of those ability scores also factor into your skill checks as well. So if you are rolling a perception check, you're going to take your wisdom modifier. So if that's like a +1 or a +2, that adds on to your d20 roll for a perception check.
So let's talk a bit about how the rolled points go.
You roll 4 6-sided die, and you write down that total of the highest 3. You get to drop the lowest one.
Yes.
And then you do that for each of your scores.
So before you do this, grab a piece of scratch paper.
Yeah.
Because these are going to be some throwaway numbers, but you need to write them down.
Yeah, because you don't have to pick. I think that's important to know. At least as I've never made anyone pick. I let them roll all of their numbers first. Roll your 6 numbers, and then you can assign them when you're done.
Right, and that's only how I've ever done it. I didn't know. I guess that people could be
You could really live on the edge.
Yeah, oh my God, I cannot imagine that.
No. Yeah, no.
So the interesting one of these three is the point buy, because none of us have done it. But essentially, what it's giving you is it's giving you that standard array of numbers plus a few others, and it's assigning a cost to those. So you would start with 27 points, and then each of those numbers has a cost associated with them, and then you assign those numbers until you've used up your 27 points. So it's a pretty straightforward process. It's just not something we have done in the past.
I think one of the interesting points there, if you kind of look at some of the number of points they assign to these, if you want a 15, it costs you 9 points. If you want an 8, it costs you 0. So you could do 15, 15, 15, 0, 0, 0, and create like this crazy type of character to play. Super strong in 3 skills and has a -1 modifier in 3 other skills.
Boy, that sounds awful.
Right?
Not a bad character,
Not
potentially.
necessarily. You could be great.
It's another interesting way. I like to live life on the edge a little bit more. I mean, with your rolling the dice, you can get potentially a better roll off of it too.
Well, yeah, you could get higher than a standard array. You roll 3 6s and you have an 18. You're all of a sudden you're up to a +4 modifier
At
on a
level
level 1
one?
character.
Oh.
Correct.
Right.
I think it's worth the risk. Yes, you could roll a 3.
I mean, that's how Zeus ended up with Achilles, was he assigned an 8 to his heel, and that was not a good decision. At least we all know how that turned out.
But if you're gonna roll a 3, you're rolling 5, 6 ones. Like, the chances of that are pretty astronomical.
Agreed.
So I think live life on the edge. Go for the rolled dice when picking rolled dice, or even just taking your standard. But I would push you to take the rolled ability scores.
So next on the process of building a character is describing your character, which encompasses a lot of things like picking your alignment, ideals, flaws, background. A lot of this is, at least from my perspective in the past, is rolling off of tables. I mean, alignment, there is some of how you're going to role play your character in there, but the rest of it is mostly, hey, I'm going to roll and see what this ends up being, kind of thing.
And so alignment, just for anyone who's not familiar, right? Like, that's your moral compass, basically, right? Are you a good aligned character or an evil aligned character? Are you a chaotic character, a neutral character, a lawful character? And it's kind of a spectrum, right, that you can live in. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about alignment. And honestly, it's a choice. If you're going to try to lean towards an evil aligned character, you need to talk to your DM, because that can vastly impact the party dynamics. If you're the only evil aligned character and everyone else in your party is, let's say, they're lawful good, that's a problem, right? We got to figure that out. So make sure that you talk through that if you're leaning on anything towards, I would guess, the evil alignment, unless you're playing an evil campaign.
I would also say, to add on to that, typically the class you pick is going to at least give you an idea of what type of alignment that you're going to play. I mean, your clerics, your paladins are going to be good characters. Now they can range within that because of the neutral, the lawful, and things like that.
Deity choice.
But for the most part, you're going to have an idea before you ever get to this point of what your character should be. And like Phil said, you're probably not going to play an evil character unless there's a weird dynamic that you're trying to pull out within your party.
Most of your background, when you're trying to describe your character and pick that section of your character sheet, is a lot of just flavor. It gives some background on like where your character is coming from and how they're coming into their abilities and their lifestyle. But part of your background does lend itself to giving you additional perks onto your sheet and giving you bonuses for different things.
Yeah, you can pick up some additional languages. Sometimes you get like skill proficiencies or tool proficiencies. I would say if you flip through the backgrounds and you find one that you like some of the features of, but maybe the flavor text doesn't necessarily fit your character, just try to work with your DM to see if they'll be lenient with you there to create your own custom background. You could still grant you the same basically bonuses or proficiencies that you might get from, whatever the player's handbook version of that background is. But you can tailor it to, support the character that you're actually wanting to play. I feel the same way about the ideals, the bonds, the flaws. I'm not sure what you guys think. A lot of those are rolled tables. And I always roll on the table, but if I read it and it doesn't quite fit, I either try to modify it to fit the character I'm building, or I just read through the whole list then and pick one that I think matches.
Right. I mean that's how I do it too. And kind of just to circle back a little bit, when you pick your class, it will actually have a suggested background for your character. So again, read through those and know what they are, because you may want something specific, but it will also hold your hand a little bit and say, hey, if you want to build something that fits for this character, choose this background. So it is really helpful in that way. The next thing, moving on, would be talking about equipment. And classes, again, have equipment that your character is going to start with. But guys, how do we pick those things?
I think you pick on playstyle, honestly, because usually it's giving you choices of like weapons, choices of armor sometimes, choices of an equipment pack, which doesn't make that much of a difference. I'm going to go out there and say that. But a lot of times your weapon choices are between, maybe a melee weapon or a ranged weapon or a simple weapon versus a martial weapon. And some of those are differences based on, what are you proficient with? So you have to know your proficiencies. And then also, what kind of weapon do you want to swing? Like, what's your flavor?
Totally. Go ahead, Brett.
I would say a lot of this is also stuff that you're probably not going to come across. You're not going to go seek out a bunch of rope necessarily. Like, this is just a bunch of that early starting stuff that is nice to have in your backpack that you're not going to seek out. It's nice to just already have it be there.
I think it's important to point out that you may come into building your character thinking, boy, I really want a pike. But depending on your class, it's actually going to tell you you're going to choose between this and this. You may come across those things later or buy those things later, but at the end of the day, it's going to say you're going to get a great axe or you're going to get a long sword. And then you can go to the table and see which one causes more damage, essentially, or which one are you... It's not going to tell you something you're not proficient with already.
But I wouldn't say any of them are necessarily bad. It's just kind of... As long as you're familiar with how they're kind of going to be played, or even what they are, you're pretty much there on being able to pick from them.
And if you don't know what they are, go check out the weapons table, the armor table, like read through them, figure out what kind of damage they do. Some of them are finesse weapons that let you use some of your dexterity instead of strength to use them as your attack rolls. So look into that, especially if you're playing maybe a dexterity-based character. I will say on the equipment pack side, as a personal preference, if I have choice of a burglar's pack, I'm always picking the burglar's pack so I can try to figure out how to use the 1,000 ball bearings.
So many options on that one.
Now, with that said, that's a good point, though, Phil, because, I mean, we centered a lot of that conversation just now around picking weapons, but there's so much other equipment. Certain classes are going to have, for example, a cleric's going to have vestments, which is essentially priest robes and things like that. Like, you're going to have certain equipment that you will just have with you, but then you're going to get a choice between a chest set or dragon bones or something like that, where you're just going to have to decide.
A bard's instrument, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Can have a huge impact, not necessarily on how your character plays, but just on your flavor.
Mm-hmm.
Or the additional tools that you have available, like thieves' tools.
Yeah.
Having those already on your character when you're starting at level 1, you're ready to roll. Then you don't have to go seek those out at a later date.
And I think it's important to note that sometimes it will give you a proficiency, like let's say you're proficient in brewer's supplies, but you may not have something in your background or in your class that actually gives you that set of tools. So it is important to kind of notate the difference. Just because you're proficient in something doesn't necessarily mean you were granted that as starting equipment.
Totally. Okay, so and we've hit on this last point. We've hit on this a little bit already, but it's coming together with your party and discussing the campaign that you're going to play. So does your character fit? I think the key point in here is one we've already made is this should be probably higher up the list. You need to know who else is in your party in order to create the character. Sure, you're going to still create what you want, but knowing that you need to be a healer or a frontline attacker or something like that, it's good to come together earlier in that process than later.
It helps to have more of a variety amongst your different types of characters in a party. Because you all have strengths, you all have weaknesses, and figuring out how to balance those amongst a party can make a much smoother campaign.
I think it just makes a more fun party to play, too, because if you have a bunch of characters that are basically trying to play the same role, you just end up with competing almost characters at that point, right? You're just trying to be the same role in the party, and So having a good mix, I think, is important to a successful long-term campaign.
All right, before we wrap up tonight, we do need to talk about the elephant in the room. So create it on paper or create your character in D&D Beyond. I know we have a preference, but let's start this conversation and see where it goes.
There is no preference. Like if you're doing it on paper, you're doing it just because you want the challenge, maybe, or you're an alternator that is familiar enough to be able to do it.
Or your DM showed up with paper and you don't know anything different.
Yeah, true.
Or you don't have a phone or a laptop and you don't have any other choice.
Yeah.
I get it. Or, yes, your DM shows up with paper and they want you to create it on paper. I will say, as a DM that has showed up with paper, I've allowed people to create it on paper, and then after they did that, I asked them to add it to Beyond, so that way I could see all of the information.
It's just so much easier. When everything is there on the website, it pulls up all of the options that you have for that selection right there for you at the time. You can reference, what does this weapon do, or what does this weapon do? It's one click away, where you don't have to flip through a whole bunch of books, go to different books to be able to find that information.
I think the biggest benefit, at least for me, was when I had a paper character, it was very hard when I would level up to go back and change, because I would write in, okay, this gives me 1d8 of whatever. And then, especially if I had a pencil that couldn't erase worth a crap, all of a sudden my player's sheet was a mess. And Beyond, you don't have to worry about that. It automatically is adjusting that as you go. You never have to worry about erasing thing. It's just going to keep it current for the level that you're on.
Even on one of the starter packs that I have, which is like a pre-built campaign, just a short little short session, it's got a bunch of pre-made characters on there, and they're really overly filled. They're filled out by D&D, but I would much rather go and build something on D&D Beyond, because it's streamlined, it calculates things for you automatically, and it doesn't have all that extra text that maybe even a pre-built character would already have.
I just feel like with a paper version of your character sheet, it's a lot to maintain, because to Ross's point, every time you level up, you have to check on so many things. Did your proficiency bonus change? If it did, what other numbers do you need to change?
Whew.
Did you take an ability score increase? You upped your strength by 2. Okay, well now what skills or saving throws does that apply to? It applies to all of your weapon attacks now too. I mean, keeping that sheet maintained, the chance of you having perfect accuracy on that paper sheet,
so small.
Correct.
So small.
And short rest. If you're a spellcaster, short rest, long rest, being able to do that and Beyond and automatically recover your spell slots, recover your hit dice with the click of a button.
Yes. Versus filling and erasing all those dots every
Correct.
time. Oh my goodness.
Also, pro tip, if you're going to fill it out on paper, use pencil with a really good eraser.
Pen is not your friend.
No, because you're going to be changing your sheet
Yes.
over time.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, final thoughts on building a character.
This is one, especially as you get further into D&D, you're going to be doing quite a bit, especially if you get into doing one-shots, small sessions. If you're going into a full campaign, a long-term campaign, spend some time, dedicate some research on figuring out what type of character you want to do, because you're going to be using this one for a while.
I love building characters, and if I go into my D&D Beyond, you can store characters. I've got more characters than I've ever played, because I enjoy the character building process and building out different combinations of, ooh, what if I played this class in this race? Like, what would that look like? Or, oh, I want to fly now. I'm going to pick a race that's not in the player's handbook. I think it just opens you up to so many possibilities. To Brett's point, if you're going to play a long-term campaign, make sure you're going to play a character that you enjoy playing. Because if not, and you get stuck in a long campaign, it may not be as enjoyable as you initially would think. If you get into it and you don't like your character, talk to your DM. Like, see what you can do. There are options that are there.
And I would say one other thing is, don't necessarily try and optimize your character to be the best possible version of a class.
No.
A lot of fun can be had from taking an oddball race and fitting it with something that it normally doesn't fit with. If you take a halfling barbarian, that could be really fun. You're a halfling badass coming to break things and smash things. if that walks into the room, that would be a lot of fun to play.
I think it boils down to D&D allows you to do what you want. So if you have this idea for a character, build that character. It's fine. Have fun with it. That's the whole point at the end of the day. And if you get into playing D&D, you're going to be building a lot of characters over the course of your playing time anyway. So, you may spend more time if you know you're going to be spending a lot of time with a character. You're going to spend a little more time building that one out. But at the end of the day, you're still going to be building, if you're doing one-shots and things like that, you're going to build hundreds, well, not hundreds, 15 to 20 characters at least.
Dozens.
You're gonna dozens. Thank you. You're gonna be building a lot of characters. So it's a quick skill to pick up. It's nothing that can ever really be perfected. So don't try to do it.
And you're going to continue leveling up the character over time if you're playing a campaign. So you will progress. It's not the end all be all of your character. This is the start to a character.
Okay, that's going to do it for this episode of Bards and Barrels. You can listen to past episodes of the show anywhere podcasts can be found. Want to stay in the loop and not miss the latest from us? Be sure to head over and give us a like at facebook.com/bardsandbarrels. We'll see you soon.